Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. We have a really great topic today for two really strong panels, and I want to welcome you all to AEI. I'm Robert Doerr, the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, and over the last couple of years, we have built up a program on poverty studies at AEI that involves encouraging and supporting and promoting good scholarship and good ideas on issues concerning low-income and poor Americans. And a leading star of our efforts is the great Brad Wilcox, who is here today with another of his productions, Soulmates, which he wrote with Nick Wolfinger, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. And that is the general topic of our conversation this morning. And I'm very happy about it because often when we talk about struggling Americans, we talk about problems and difficulties and deficiencies. And that's awfully frustrating, and it passes over advantages and assets and good news, and where things are, people in communities are doing positive things to improve people's lives and setting strong examples. And my friend Bob Woodson often reminds me that we've got to talk about both. You can't only talk about the deficiencies, you also have to talk about assets. And religion and faith-based organizations are assets in poor communities. They provide leadership and guidance and love, and we need to encourage and promote that as much as we do talk about the difficulties. So that's what I love about this event today and our conversation that will begin today. After I turn it over, I'm going to moderate the discussion, but joining us to talk about Brad and Nick's book are, starting from my far right, Jamal Bowie, who's a staff writer for Slate magazine, where he writes on national politics, history, public policy, and racial inequality. Previously, Mr. Bowie was a staff writer at the Daily Beast and the American Prospect. Next to Jamal is Jacqueline Rivers, who is the executive director of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. Her latest publication is a chapter in Not Just Good, But Beautiful, the complementary relationship between man and woman. She has also co-authored a chapter with Orlando Patterson, one of our favorites here at AEI as well. He came to speak at a really great event about a year ago, in the Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. Dr. Rivers holds a PhD from Harvard. And then another one of our favorites who's been here frequently is Michelle Singletary, who writes the nationally syndicated personal finance column, The Color of Money, which appears in the Washington Post and is carried in more than 100 newspapers. In 2010, she released her third personal finance book, The Power to Prosper, 21 Days to Financial Freedom. I would like to get to financial freedom in 21 days. and just to bring it around to our topic today, my wife would like me to do as well. So marriage, money, that all comes together. And then finally, our leader today, W. Bradford Wilcox, is the visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project. Inaugurated in the fall of 2013, the research project explores the links between family structure and economic growth in 20 countries around the world. Dr. Wilcox is also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project. We'll start out with Brad, go to Jamal, then Jackie, then Michelle. I'll ask some questions, then we'll look for questions from the audience. And I'm really glad we're all here today. Thank you very much for being here. Brad, take it away.
Robert, thank you for that gracious introduction. I'd like to also just thank Brad Wasink and many other colleagues at AI for making today's event possible, and my colleagues also at UVA, including Sam Richardson, who is here, and at the Institute for Family Studies. Everyone has worked to make today's event and today's book with Nick Wolfinger possible, and I'm grateful to everyone for the work that they've done. So we're talking today about soulmates, and I want to begin with a story from the book to give you a sense of some of the kinds of findings and arguments that we offer in the book. So on September 11th, 2001, Michael Brown was hit hard by events beyond his control. On that fateful day, this 29-year-old black man's job as an office manager at the World Trade Center was obliterated by Al Qaeda. And after losing his job, he struggled to find work. Michael ended up finding a job at a taxi company, working his way up to be a dispatcher there. And the work was difficult, partly because he labored long hours to earn about half of what he had at his previous job. Michael was also frustrated because his income had fallen well below what his wife, Letitia, was making. Indeed, Michael's job travails led some of Letitia's friends to disparage him. They were like, "Oh, he's becoming like a no-good black man," she said. Some men in his shoes might have given up, but Michael did not. What kept him going? His faith, in part. "I did the job of the taxi company as unto the Lord, and so I took that to mean I'm doing the job as if Jesus Christ himself was signing my paycheck," recalls Michael. "I worked really hard, and because of that, I was elevated to dispatcher in 3 years. If I didn't work as hard, I don't know where I would be. I probably would have been fired because they had no problems firing people," he laughs. Michael also took comfort from the brother-to-brother group of men at his church, Faith Deliverance Church in Brooklyn. "I have all these people around, and they help us out, and they do keep us in line. So we know we can call some people if we're really going through difficulties, It's just comforting to know that God's provided that kind of thing for us." Michael's wife's support was also crucial during this tough transition. When we interviewed them in 2006, Letitia said this: "Because we don't have the money we used to, he kind of feels down. But I don't mind that. I told him that what every woman wants is security in their marriage. And to hear you pray every night and pray as you do, and to see you studying the Bible, how you love God, that's good enough for me." In talking to her, it became clear that her faith and her faith in him helped Michael to keep his life together, to keep his commitment to his work and his life more generally going. And so what is evident from Michael and Letitia's life is that their faith has buffered them from many of the challenges, economic or relational, for instance, facing all too many black men and black families in America. Unemployment, incarceration, and poverty are dramatically higher among blacks and whites, and marriage is markedly lower among African Americans. These stark facts and the tragedies in places like Sanford, Florida, Ferguson, and Baltimore have brought the predicament of black men and black families to center stage. Scholars, pundits, and politicians across the spectrum, from Ta-Nehisi Coates to Jason Riley, from Barack Obama to Rand Paul, have weighed in on these subjects, as everyone here knows. But this conversation, I think, hasn't necessarily acknowledged the ways in which today many black Americans and many black families are flourishing. In fact, millions of black men and millions of black families are thriving. We know that the majority of African Americans will marry. They'll have their kids in a committed relationship. They'll enjoy a high quality relationship, as we're going to see in a few slides. And they value marriage. So we know, for instance, that by the time they hit their 40s, 76% of black men have married, and 68% of black women have married. So clearly marriage is alive and well to important degrees in the black community. And then when it comes to the cultural front, we also know that African Americans have mainstream family values. There's, of course, been discussions about that in some precincts in the media. In fact, 56% of blacks feel that it's better to be married than to be single, a number that's clearly somewhat higher than what we see among whites here in the country. So in many respects, the family-related beliefs and behaviors of African Americans, I think, are stronger than the words of many of our politicians and pundits might suggest. And I think one reason that's the case is that so many black families are connected in some way to religious institutions. In fact, here you can see that African Americans are the most likely group when it comes to different racial and ethnic groups in America to be attending religious services. And not surprisingly, given the more secular cast of the academy and the media, this fact is often gone unacknowledged in our discussions about black families, black men, and African American society more generally. So what exactly do we find about the connection between church going and black family life, that is, between the black church and the black family. Well, we find that religious attendance among African Americans is linked to less non-marital childbearing, to higher marriage rates, and to happier relationships. Take, for instance, Kim Davis, a 38-year-old woman living in the Atlanta metro area, who says that her faith anchors her marriage. She talks about it in these kinds of ways. Quote, "It's wonderful when you're down, you have a husband, a partner, a friend that can say, 'I see that you're going through some things. Let us pray together,' said Kim," adding, "It's wonderful when my husband can say, 'Baby, I haven't really seen you picking up your Bible the last couple of days. You all right?'" And then because of her faith, she is motivated to continuously work on her marriage, from regularly kissing her husband to the small acts of sacrifice that give a marriage a better tone. Quote, "Whatever it takes to make the other person feel good, that's what you have to continue, as opposed to being selfish and thinking that I have that person and that's it," she said. It's also important to acknowledge here, as the title for the slide suggests, that one of the things that we find in the work is that it's really that shared faith that's much more likely to be associated with stronger marriages, where when just one partner, one spouse has faith, it's typically not necessarily helpful for that relationship. And Kim Davis is one example of that finding in the research. So what exactly are we talking about in terms of numbers, in terms of the statistics in the story? What we find is that when you look at couples, and this is both married and cohabiting couples in the research, that a clear majority of people are reporting high-quality relationships, but you have about a 9 percentage point increase, if you will, or higher level of happiness for couples who are attending together, and that's true for African Americans here, obviously, as well as for whites and Latinos. So there is a kind of additional wedded bliss, if you will, associated with joint church attendance for African Americans as well as for other Americans. And what's happening here? What's going on? How do we kind of break out this church-going effect? Well, it's important to note that in the book we find that two particular mechanisms help to account for the link between joint church-going and higher quality relationships. One was about friendships. So we found that couples who had lots of shared friendships in their religious communities were more likely to be thriving. So having the kind of the support, the counsel, even kind of the social control of shared friends, kind of keeping you on the straight and narrow was helpful. A second thing that we found was that shared prayer for couples was a key factor in explaining this link. And we think here that prayer, from a kind of sociological perspective, fosters a kind of unique intimacy for couples to have prayer together about important things in their life. And then also, too, I think it fosters a capacity for reflection. You can kind of reflect on kind of where you've been, where you are, and where you want to go as a couple and as a family. And in sort of this busy world that we live in, I think prayer is one of the few opportunities for couples oftentimes to kind of be more reflective about what's happening and where they should be heading. But then kind of more generally, we think, too, that church-going is linked to connecting people to preaching and teaching that's helpful to their marriages and families. They're being exposed oftentimes to the golden rule, to the importance of serving others, to compromising in their marriage, and of remaining faithful to their spouse. And then finally, we think, and this is actually, there's a lot of research on this in the sociological literature, that faith acts as a kind of a buffer against stress. And if you think about your own life, your relationship with your parents, your spouse, your partner, your friends, when you're stressed out, you're often a very unhappy or ornery or otherwise difficult person to be with. And so if you have a faith that can kind of buffer against, for African Americans, the stresses of racism or of unemployment or of poverty or other kinds of ordinary things that crop up in your life, I think that's also one other reason why faith can be a resource and is a resource for African Americans in their relationships and in their families. So I've talked about kind of the black church and the black family. I want to turn now and think a little bit more particularly about black men. And of course, the predicament of black men has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, and for reasons noted above. In the wake, for instance, of the Trayvon Martin killing, President Obama launched My Brother's Keeper, with these words. He said, quote, "By almost every measure, the group that is facing some of the most severe challenges in the 21st century in this country are boys and young men of color. They face a higher chance of ending up in the criminal justice system and becoming the victim of violent crime. Fewer black men and Latino men participate in the labor force compared to young white men. And all this translates into higher unemployment rates and poverty rates as adults." Now, the president is correct, but it's also important for us, not to sort of lose sight of the fact that most black men will not end up incarcerated, that most black men are not unemployed, and that most black men are not poor. And so, again, one of the things that we think is happening here, one of the parts of this sort of story that hasn't necessarily been told enough, is that one reason black men are often flourishing is that they're more likely to be religious than their other male peers here in the United States. And so in our view, black men's connection to the black church matters. It makes them stronger. Michael Brown's experience, discussed at the beginning today, is not an outlier. Our book indicates that black men who are church-going are significantly less likely to commit crime, to end up incarcerated, idle, or abusing alcohol or drugs. Take idleness, for instance. What we can see here is that black men who are church-going, young black men who are church-going, are about a third less likely to be idle, that is, to be not working or not in school, compared to their peers who are not regularly attending church. So this is, again, one way in which the black church is helping black men in America. And the black church does this in part, I think, by helping young men steer clear of what Yale sociologist Elijah Anderson has called the code of the street, a code marked by, if need be, violent self-assertion, criminal or off-the-books activity, and a live-for-the-moment mentality, and towards the code of decency, a code marked by hard work, honesty, temperance, consideration of others, and other mainstream values. In his words, decent people, quote, "value hard work and self-reliance, have a certain amount of faith in mainstream society, and often derive great support from their faith and from the church community." So again, what Elijah Anderson is stressing is the way in which the black church reinforces the code of decency among its members. And one sort of example of this came in a sermon from the Reverend Calvin Butts of Abyssinian Baptist Church, who is at one of the most prominent pulpits in New York, in a sermon entitled "The Recovery of Righteousness." In that sermon, he preached, "Most civilizations are destroyed from within. The outward manifestations of this inner decay have been threefold. Three things that you see outwardly. One is drunkenness, another is idleness, and finally immorality. This means that strong civilizations, those that are able to endure and withstand attacks from without, have sobriety, industry, and clean moral living. So, beloved, I am suggesting to you that there is no greater need before us today than the recovery of plain old-fashioned righteousness. Who among us would eschew drunkenness, idleness, and immorality? Who would dare to stand in the face of the onslaught of the culture of sin that has enveloped our nation and say, 'I refuse to succumb. I will not yield to the temptation'?" Clearly, Reverend Butts is seeking to motivate his congregation, which ranges from working to upper-class blacks from Harlem and around metropolitan New York, to steer clear of the code of the street and the vices of substance abuse, idleness, and, in his words, immorality. Butts, though, is careful to make his pitch for righteousness accessible and credible to his congregation by humorously acknowledging that his own past is not pristine and that he needs spiritual encouragement in his own effort to live right. So in his words, quote, "It ain't no secret that Reverend Butts ain't always been Reverend Butts. You know that. I had my season in the far country too. I was deep in the far country," laughter in the congregation. "But each one of us has a commitment to God. That commitment is that through Christ, we will lead lives worthy of God's grace. I will not get high, for instance, and ask God to have mercy on me, because you got it together. You know what is happening in the community. You in the street every day. You saw the preacher from around the corner in the bar. You know what is happening. I don't go for that. Pray for me. I need prayer so that I can try to the best of my ability to walk the straight and narrow and to appear before men and women as perhaps an example. So Butts' powerful, perceptive, and pastorally savvy rhetoric suggests that the culture of the black church, the ideals, the images, and the attitudes lifted up in pulpits, Bible studies, and fellowship halls, and congregations across the country is one reason that black men who regularly attend church are more likely to flourish in today's America. Such men are encouraged both explicitly and implicitly to live out a code of decency that is good for them, their families, and their communities. And it helps that this code is endowed with transcendent significance, as both Wilson's rhetoric and Brown's experience suggests. Recall that Brown was working not just for himself, but as if Jesus Christ himself was signing his paycheck. And then finally, the impact that the black church has upon black men, in our view, redounds to the benefit of black families, as suggested here both by the higher quality of the Brown relationship and their experience more generally. So to conclude, the work that the black church is doing to strengthen black families and black men could not be more important. That's because despite the legal, educational, economic progress that African Americans have made since the Civil Rights era, racial inequality endures. It obviously endures in our nation's schools, our nation's streets, and the ledgers of our nation's bank accounts. And one reason that racial inequality endures is that African American men, women, and children are less likely to realize their dreams of a strong and stable marriage and family life than their fellow Americans. This Harvard study, for instance, tells us that racial inequality in family income in America persists in part because too few black families enjoy the advantage of being headed by two parents. In sociologist Deirdre Bloom's words, even though, quote, economic trends were equalizing, demographic trends were disequalizing. As family structures shifted, family incomes did not fully realize or fully reflect labor market gains, unquote, for African Americans. In other words, the fragility of the black family is one obstacle that's been standing in the way of racial economic justice in America. So to the extent that the black church has been a bulwark of strong black families in America, it has advanced the cause of racial justice. Indeed, as Soulmates makes clear, countless marriages have been forged, families saved, and men redeemed by the black church over the years. And clearly there is much to be done, both inside and outside of the church, to build on this legacy of success. But today, I think, it's important to acknowledge the work the church has done in strengthening the black family, and by implication, the cause of racial justice in America. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Now we're going to have reactions from each of our panelists and then a conversation. Jamal?
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Brad, for inviting me to participate. I think I have around 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to make this quick. As you can see, I have a lot of notes taken over the past roughly 48 hours, and I'm not going to fit all of this in 300 seconds, but we'll see. So I have two observations and sort of like a question kind of looking forward point. The first observation is simply that I am glad, both as a kid who grew up in the black church and as someone who studies and observes this stuff, to see that the black church is getting the kind of attention I think it deserves. I know in political analysis, sort of the black church is rarely talked about as an important site for civic engagement, for social solidarity, for really, as Brad mentioned, mainstreaming Black Americans and sort of creating sites for participation in mainstream society. So it's really, I think its work is very valuable. I'm glad to see it. I hope it gets more mainstream attention. I'm glad to see the key points that many, if not most, African Americans are doing pretty well. I think, because I think pessimism is easier news. It's easy to focus on all of the problems, but there are real strengths and advantages I think Black Americans have because of their sort of broad involvement with the church that is worth talking about, studying, and sort of even maybe looking to for answers and insights for other kind of groups and other problems. Second observation. The Black church produces stability, and I think it is the duty of mainstream Americans and mainstream society to bolster the stability that produces. For as much as there has been real gains in racial equality, there have also been these massive structural headwinds that we're all familiar with, whether those are the rapid increases in incarceration that we saw in the 80s and 90s, and that have continued into the present decade. Whether that is the still, I think, unaddressed effects of mass deindustrialization that we saw in working class Black communities in the 70s and 80s, in that, you know, the legacy of which is persistently high unemployment among young African American men, and a persistently, you know, I want to say for the past 4 or 5 decades, the unemployment rate among African Americans has been double that of white Americans, regardless of broader economic conditions. And the persistence of residential segregation, which is driven not just through the overhang of past discrimination, as you know, Patrick Sharkey demonstrates aptly in his book "Stuck in Place," where he shows the degree to which, you know, if you look at the population of inner city projects, inner city neighborhoods, the people who lived there in, say, the 1970s, their descendants still largely live there in the 1980s and 90s and the present. So it's not just that, but also present day discrimination in housing markets, which has been documented, is working to reduce key parts of mobility for Black Americans and act as a headwind against the stability that the Black church helps create. So I think while acknowledging and praising the strength of the Black church, what it's done to promote marriage and promote strong families, all of these negative inputs that are in large part a legacy of racism or simply just present day continued racism, we have a duty to help the Black church do its job, and to reduce those negative inputs, eliminate them, and use every tool we have in the book to work towards that goal. This observation question, I kind of just like wrote a bunch and a question mark at the end, so who knows what it is that, and this goes back to what I said earlier, there's been a lot of recent coverage of the increase in mortality rates among both middle-aged, low-income, and working-class white men, and to a lesser extent white women, and also on the younger end, white men and white women in their early 20s, late teens. To my eyes, what we're witnessing is essentially what happened to working class Blacks 20 years ago and 30 years ago. So what can we learn from the Black church, from the experience of Black Americans in confronting these trends that we can use to address this present day phenomena and this present day crisis? And I think there's a lot of space there for discussion and for analysis that hasn't, I don't think, been explored, at least in the mainstream press. But I think work like this helps people see the analogy, as it were, and produces, helps people move forward in trying to make that analysis. So there it is.
Thank you. That's a great start. Jackie, you're next.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Press the
I guess it was on. I turned it off. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Brad and AEI for inviting me to speak on this very important topic. I want to agree that there really are both structural and cultural pressures on the Black family. I think we're all too familiar with the high unemployment rates, mass incarceration, all of which really undermine the black family. But what's interesting is that even the most liberal scholars, Christopher Jenks, for example, Chris Winship at Harvard, agree that the structural problems cannot account for the level, the intensity of the retreat from marriage in the black community. Murray and Winship found that unemployment only accounted for 60% of the retreat from marriage. This was research done back in the 90s. And Chris Jenks says, look, it's not just about structure, it's also about culture. And he credits the rise in autonomy and personal freedom for really the retreat from marriage. And here he's not just talking about in the black community, because in fact the rise in out-of-wedlock birth rates has affected all ethnic groups. For this reason, it seems that this question about that Brad and Nick are highlighting in their work, that the church has a role to play, is really critical. It's not so easy to turn back the culture. We can't go back to the industrial economy that created jobs for black men. We can't undo the changes in reproductive technology, which according to Janet Yellen and her husband, according to their work, has actually significantly changed the way people think about, have decoupled sex, marriage, and childbirth. We can't undo those things. So it seems as though we really have to think about what can we do on the cultural front. And that's where the church may have a very important role to play, the black church in particular. I wanted to talk a little bit too about this idea that Orlando Patterson explores in his latest book, The Cultural Matrix, the difference between injunctive and observational norms. So Brad reports that, in fact, when you talk to blacks about how much they value marriage, it's a little bit higher than you find among white couples. But is that just an injunctive norm? Is that the ought? Because if you look at the observational norm, that is what's actually happening, it really doesn't appear, it's clear that that's not what's happening in the black community. Almost 2 out of every 3 black children is being raised without both parents. That's an astonishing figure. Not as astonishing, of course, as a familiar figure that 72% of black babies are born out of wedlock. However, the work of Eden and Kafalis, as Brad points out, underlines this shift in even the injunctive norms. So the observational norms changed first, what was actually happening in the community, but it seems as though it's shifted the injunctive norm. No longer do couples get married to start a family and establish themselves economically, and according to Eden and Kafalis, this is no longer just among blacks, but increasingly also among poor whites and poor Hispanics. Instead, marriage is a capstone after you've made it. But we're really shooting ourselves in the foot, because marriage improves men's economic performance. It improves their lives generally. It improves, therefore, the marriage partners that women have. And it, most importantly, improves outcomes for children. Because children, as we all know, raised in single-parent households, underperform academically, have more behavioral problems, have more psychological problems. These persist into adulthood. They are more likely to be incarcerated. They have higher levels of unemployment. They're more likely to have unstable marriages if they get married, to have out-of-wedlock births. In fact, it's a vicious cycle, a virtuous cycle among the upper middle class, who are the only people who are still really getting married. So their children get all the benefits of being raised in 2-parent households. They're more likely to get married themselves. They continue to go from strength to strength, whereas among the poor, and especially among the black poor, the opposite is happening. This is a familiar story that we're not supposed to be telling this morning, right? We're supposed to focus on what's good. But I think if we don't remind ourselves of what we're up against, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. How do we impact the injunction norms and send them back in the opposite direction? That's where Brad and Nick have brought us good news in highlighting the role of the black church. Black churches played a critical role in the black community for many, many decades, if not centuries, since the end of slavery. We have been the source of cooperative self-help for strainers and strivers who are trying to get ahead, and for aid for the poor. We were the base of the civil rights movement that made such a tremendous change in the U.S. in culture in the South. And even now, according to research done in Philadelphia, the Black church is contributing almost $250 million annually in services, social services provided to residents, not just to their members, but also to residents who don't belong to their churches. The challenge before the Black church then is, as Brad has pointed out, how do we pick up the pace? Because Brad and Nick's research indicates that the impact of frequent church going on Black couples in terms of reducing out of wedlock births and reducing divorce is not as strong as it is among whites. They suggest it's because these topics are not addressed as directly in the Black church. So we have work to do in the Black church to really increase the rate at which we are engaging on these topics and providing social supports to families that are going through, couples going through a rough patch, families raising children. How do we increase the understanding of the commitment to the injunctive norms of marriage first for the sake of women, men, and children? In addition to that, I think we also have to think about the question of accountability, starting with Black preachers. Let us be the example of what we want our members to be. So we have got to do better in terms of how we hold people accountable when they fall short, in particular our leaders, when they fall short in these areas. And I especially want to underline also that there's an incredibly powerful cultural force at work. Music and popular culture, which is going in the opposite direction, which is hypersexualized, which promotes infidelity, which is in our children's ear every minute of the day. As my son, when he was a teenager, talked about, we were on safari and he was listening to his music and he talked about the soundtrack of his teenage life. So there we are, so far away, and still that music is in his ear. It's everywhere. It's all over social media. The Black church is in a position to mount an effort to change this through social media. How do we meet the kids where they are on social media, begin to promulgate a different view of the world, which is more productive, more healthy, better for them in the long run? How do we engage with the artists who are actually shaping the culture at the highest levels? How do we get them to begin to think differently? My husband likes to point out, this is Reverend Eugene Rivers, he likes to point out that so many of these artists actually have roots in the Black church. And some of them, like Kendrick Lamar, actually proclaim that they are Christians. So how do we actually get them to go in a different direction? And my final thought on this is how important the religious freedom of the church is then. If we are the ones who are making a difference for what's good, what's happening in the Black community. And I want to point out the one place where I think also Black church needs to focus its efforts, and that's low-skilled Black men. Because for them, almost 2/3 of low-skilled Black men are incarcerated. 2 out of every 3. Let us get them into the pews, because the Black church is dominated by women. It's predominantly a female experience. How do we in the Black church have greater impact so that these men are exposed to these injunctive norms, but also that they're in a setting where the observational norms are going in the opposite direction and where there's a social support for actually doing things differently? So I think that's another place where there's a challenge for the Black church. But if we have all of this, if we've already accomplished all of this that Brad and Nick point out, and if we have this challenge and the potential to do even more, what is troubling is that in the current climate, there's growing intolerance for Christian faith, and even more so, growing intolerance for holding to the teachings of the Bible, which are the very source of these positive norms that are being taught in churches. how much more important it is. It is really in the interest of the state to make sure that there's neither let nor hindrance in the promulgation of black churches, of thriving black churches, because we have the potential to change this cultural direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. Michelle?
That's wonderful. I want to go to church right now. I'm really excited about this book because often, particularly in the world that I run, working for the Washington Post, and I'm sure for Slate and other publications, they want to see the numbers behind the feel-good things that we talk about. So what they've done is to put into research what we already know. And I say we, those of us who are faithful religious, goers or church goers. I go to church every single Sunday. My husband and I, even when we're on vacation, we find a church to go to. I had a great service in Hawaii on the beach. It's like, hey, praising the Lord in the heat on the beach. And when we talk to our children, it's so funny. I was like, well, who are you going to marry? And they actually have a list that I've given them. And I say that, I've given them, what's a perfect mate? And they run down. And if you ask my kids right now, they'll run it down. You've got to be a Christian. You've got to be tall. I'm a bigot, I'm sorry. You got to be tall. And you got to be good, and you got to handle your money well. You got to be cheap. Those are the top ones that I teach my children. Because I came from that statistic that we've been talking about. My mother and father abandoned us. My father was in jail. I was raised by my grandmother. My grandfather was an alcoholic. I am that statistic. And yet it was my faith in God that brought me out of that. And it was my faith to find a mate who was going to do that. And just like you said, I would go to church and I would see all these women with these kids dragging them around and not a lot of fathers around. Yeah. And I said, I don't want that for my children. So when I looked for a husband, he had to go to church. And he had to go to church before we started dating.
That's right.
And so, and so, and so we are a faith-going, church-going, loving family. In fact, so much so, my husband is in the discipleship ministry at our church, and when we get into an argument, he be pulling out scripture, and it ticks me off to no end. Because you can't cuss him out when he quoting scripture, And so what I guess my role here is that I write about this in my column. I am extremely bold about my faith in my column. And I talk about the things that I do at my church because I want people to know I am trying to change their culture. My children know you are not going to have kids out of wedlock if it's up to me. And I'm not coming to your house if you shacking up. And I told them that. And I had a reader say, why do you have to say shacking up? Because that's what I'm going to say. Because I want it to be bold and shocking. Because they aren't timid in talking about having sex out of wedlock. So why should I be timid to say that is not how I think it should be? Now, this is not about to be condemning folks and judging them, but we do know the numbers that if you're born in a marriage, you're more likely to succeed, and your money is so better. So if you don't mind, I want to talk about a church that is actually doing this. I'm a member of First Baptist Church of Glenarden, and I actually asked the directors of our couples ministry to be here today, and I actually want them to stand up really quick, Skip and Beverly Little, because I'm so proud of what they're doing. And they have a book coming out, I think next month, right? So You Want to Get Married. So here's how my church does it. So we have, normally you talk about premarital counseling and, people have a couple courses and, they say, okay, you can get married. That's just like crazy. So we have an intense thing, several weeks, where you just getting in, nitty gritty. And we are proud to say that most people who go through that course don't end up getting married because that's what you really want. You don't want them to get married. But beyond that, we have a program called So You Want to Get Married, because oftentimes by the time they get to that class, they've already decided they want to get married. They've already booked the hall. And so they don't break up when you find that they are not a good match. So we said, well, let's catch them before they get there. And by the way, I think it's the premarital class, you can't be living together. They ask you to uncouple if you're living together. So people have actually had to move out. And some people don't like it, and that's fine. You can get up out of here. Because that's not what we are bold, right? Because in our church, we want to take attendance to action. You know, we are a mega church. We are thousands and thousands of members. But my pastor says we want to take it beyond just coming up there on Sunday. So they have, so you think you want to get married. And what I love about that program is that it catches people before they get to the point where they can't uncouple and they end up having kids out of wedlock and shacking up and doing all the things that we know are detrimental to the family. We have a course that my husband and I teach called Mastering Money in Your Marriage. And as you can already see, if you read my column, you know I'm smacking them down left and right. Why are your money not together? What's going on? And one in particular, the thing about what they're saying in this book and what we in the media have to continue to write about is give people examples of programs that are working, that really strengthen marriage. So in Mastering Your Money, we start out saying, you know, put your money together, what's going on? And I had a session with one couple, and I'll never forget. Because a lot of the couples come in there, and really, honestly, guys, they're a step or two away from divorcing because it's just that bad. And a lot of times these courses are their last effort to save their marriage. And this couple was having issues with their money, and she was really good, and he was challenging. And we sat down to do the budget, and I said, well, you be the treasurer. She said, I want to be the treasurer. I was like, well, why do you want to be treasurer? And my husband and her husband didn't catch it, but I caught it. She was really ticked off about some of the decisions her husband had made. And I stopped the session. I said, listen, you know, just put it out there. What's going on? And she talked about how, it was one of those cases where she was making more than him. And she told him, and he just, for a second, he bent his head down and he started crying. And in that instant, she said, oh, baby, I'm so sorry. And from then on, you should see them now in church. It's like they are newlyweds, and they've been married 23 years. And that's the kind of thing that we do in our church. You know, we want to be bold in our instruction. We want to challenge people. We talk about shacking up, and we call it what it is. We put people on the spot. You don't judge them, but you definitely put them on the spot. And so what I love about this, and what I hope that we talk about more, is the kind of things that we're doing in our church to really strengthen marriages and be bold and turn the tide of culture. And we can't be ashamed to do that. My niece was living with her beau, and I was like, I'm not coming to the place. And she was like, oh, they had this big, engagement now. So, when you walk down the aisle, I'll be real happy for you. Because I'm not going to play into this. And they knew that I was really upset. In fact, they're not too happy to talk to me about it, to tell me that they were going to be living together. And those of us who are in ministry at our church, we're encouraged to go through courses as well. I go through we have a home builders course series at my church where couples come, we talk about communications and, how to better ourselves. So my husband and I have gone through those as well because we want to walk the walk too. We want to set the example because I don't want to be up there teaching and I have a jacked up marriage and our money is not tight because our money is tight. Did I say tight? As I tell my husband, it's cheaper to keep her, and he's hopefully he's on board for that. So I'm going to end there, but I just I'd hope that you'll introduce yourselves to Skip and Beverly because they are the evidence of the statistics, and there are other churches in the area who are doing the same thing, and there are people who are being bold about this and trying to show folks that our faith really is the answer to a lot of things that are going on. And I'll just end with this. My husband and I also volunteer to teach inmates who are about to be released how to handle their money. And I initially taught the courses by myself, and my husband joined me recently. And I'll tell you, I'll never forget the time one of the inmates came up afterwards, and he said, I have never seen a couple like you. I didn't even know that you existed. And I was just so emotional that in our interaction, they saw the benefit of being married and having a strong marriage. And I know that that's going to impact him and his family once he's released. So I'm grateful for this book, and I'm glad that you're putting numbers to something that we know a lot of people are doing out there.
Thank you very much, Michelle. These were really great presentations, and Brad, congratulations and to you and Nick for putting the numbers to the good stories and bringing this issue out. I have two questions that I'd like all three panelists and you as well, Brad, to address. And the first is a build off on what you said, Michelle. I'm Catholic, so and this comes out in the book that there are sometimes some testimony in the book that the Catholic Church is not often explicit on these issues and doesn't talk about it enough. I think one of the testimonies in the book, someone says, "I never have heard a homily on these issues," and I guess I want to say that Michelle, you come from a church which it is bold. How can we get more churches of all faiths to be more explicit about these issues? How can we do that? And I want to start with Jamel and go to Jackie. Just what would we do? How would we get that? How would we get more explicit discussion of these issues?
Honestly, I don't know. That's not quite my area of expertise. I tend to think about things in terms of policy, and so my hunch is that there is almost certainly space for public programs aimed at just working with churches and sort of recognizing the role they play in strengthening communities and going from there. But outside of that, I'm not sure this is the
That
question
is an
for
avenue.
me.
I mean, funding is always there, and there are faith-based initiatives and funding of marriage promotion programs. That's one. But is there? How about you, Jackie? Is there a way in which that we can speak about this, shame it? Where would we go to churches where they're not explicit and talk to them about being more explicit?
Well, I think actually this book is a step in the right direction. One thing that strikes me about the book is that it's really written for a general audience, that it's not a book intended to gather dust on the shelves of Harvard's libraries. And I think to start the conversation among the clergy, and for churches who are already doing this to begin to reach out to churches where it's not happening. I think the conversations have to start among pastors. But I think there's also really a problem that there are pastors who aren't living up to these standards themselves, and churches and denominations that aren't holding pastors accountable as they ought. So it's really a deep-seated problem that I think is going to be difficult to address, but I think starting the conversation and highlighting the examples and pointing to the power of this, that's where we start.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, and I hate to just use my church, but it's, I think, a perfect example. My pastor is the pastor for a lot of other pastors, and so we try to, one of our models in our church is duplication. So we try to duplicate the programs that we have with other churches. So when a church calls me, I'm there. We're sending them the information. Skip and Beverly visit churches. We have a couples retreat every summer, and I would say probably half the people are not even members of our church. I think what you did with Soulmates is give pastors the authority to be more bold in their homilies. But you've got to do it just more than on Sunday. Yeah. You've got to have the programs to back it up so that when you talk about it, they have a place to go. If you talk about the importance of marriage and you don't have a really good marriage program, then where do they go? It's just talk. And I think a lot of pastors today, it's to your point, they are scared to say these things because we know that church attendance is down, and people don't want to feel uncomfortable. We don't want to feel uncomfortable, but it is only in our comfort that change happens. So pastors have to be bold. Skip over there, he said some stuff that really be sending people like, whoa, but you know what? It makes them change. It makes them think. And our pastor trains us to be bold, and we say what we believe in our faith, and we're not scared to. And if you're going to leave, maybe it's not your season for change. So when I teach and talk about having a budget and having savings and not having debt for college, these days you say that, it's like they want to run you out of town. But I'm going to say it anyway. And so I think that's where you have to do. They have to be bold, and then they have to have the programs to back up when they do speak to the congregations.
Brad, you want to comment on this?
Just wanted to piggyback on Michelle's comment in terms of the point about sort of talk and programs. And, we have debates, in places like Slate, The Atlantic, and elsewhere about sort of culture and structure when it comes to challenges facing, our families by class, by race, by other important characteristics. And I think one of the ways in which the church can be effective is when, again, it marries a certain kind of discourse, certain kind of rhetoric with practical programmatic activities when it comes to employment ministries, when it comes to family ministries, so that people have not just sort of heard the message, but they've actually been supported practically in living out that message. So I think it's really important to keep, in a sense, to bring back to that debate that often happens in the culture, to bring culture and structure together in ways that are more productive.
Last question for me concerns that dialogue, Michelle, you just told us about involving a woman and a man and the economic situation and finances. A lot of data shows us that African American women are doing better in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Earnings are up or rising much faster than they are for African American men. And I wondered whether there's a role in the churches for a reconciliation around that subject. Right. Fathers bring a lot more to a marriage and to a family than just a higher paycheck than the mother.
Right.
They can bring child care. They can bring loving. It doesn't have to be that the man makes more than the woman. Is there a subject there about the role of a guy in a marriage that also needs to be addressed on both sides? Yeah. And I wondered what you guys would say about that.
I think it starts by not saying it's his paycheck and her paycheck. The way we teach in ours is one paycheck. So if he's making 50 and she's making 100, they're making 150.
God bless.
And so we try to teach them that when when we get married, you're supposed to be one. Scripture says you're one. So that's everything.
Right.
And so when I get a check, my husband says, "Praise the Lord, we got some money." And so that's how
I do that about my wife's paycheck.
So that's how we address it, so that we don't look at it his, hers, and ours. It's all ours. And that's how we have to, I think, address that issue. And I do think that you're absolutely right. We have only valued men on just their paycheck. Now, I definitely think he's got to bring something to the table. Maybe he's a stay-at-home dad. That's cool too. So let's change the dialogue that men are just about the money. And I know when I was looking for a mate, that's what I was looking for. He's going to go to church. He's going to help, with the kids, and not just help. He does. When I go away, my kids are like, hey, because I'm a crazy person, and so they love that dad is running the family. So you're absolutely right. But I think it goes back to changing how we talk about the income that's coming into the house. Correct. It's all joint. It's all one. Like I tell people, they don't want to bring their money together, but they sleep together. But that person can smother you in your sleep. So you value your money more than, the person. So why wouldn't you want to bring your money together? And if you don't want to bring your money together, then you shouldn't be marrying that person.
Any other comments from? Okay.
All right, let's open it up for questions from the audience. We have some, any? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, fascinating. I'm just wondering, how do we get this message to media, to the movie industry? I have 4 kids in their 20s. We're Hispanic, we're Catholic, and obviously I'm very bold. I'm no shacking up, none of that, but they're the exception. And they feel like they're the exception because everywhere around them, kids, it's almost expected to shack up. And that's what they're seeing in movies. That's what they're seeing around them. So how do we get this message into that world?
I think that is really the kind of challenge that we are struggling with. How do we get, cracking Hollywood, that's much more difficult. And for us, really hip-hop is the culture of youth. It's no longer black culture. Globally, that's what youth plug into. And so the question about how we get to some of these artists and get somebody like Kendrick Lamar to actually begin to talk about some of these issues in his rap, I think that's one of the places to start. And Yuval Levine talks about the need to really also do it really at the local level. How do we start at the local level? Maybe churches begin to figure out how to improve their online social media presence and to disseminate a different set of values. Also important, I think, to help our children find and I say this as one challenged, not somebody who has cracked the nut on this, but how do we help them find like-minded young people who are practicing the same values and can reinforce what they're doing? Look, Christianity was always intended to be countercultural. That's how I read the Bible. So we're always going to be going against the mainstream. But we need companionship to do it. We were always intended to support each other. So I think one of the critical things for young people is to help them plug into social support groups that will reinforce their values.
Yeah, I agree. And like, for example, at my church, they have a scholarship program, and part of the scholarship is really very generous, but you have to be active in a church or a ministry to continue to get the money. So that's a lot of incentive to be, and my daughter's like that. But don't underestimate the power of one, because what you're teaching your children, they are influencing their peers. Because what studies show, we think that it's just culture that influences our children, but it really is parents. We have the greatest impact on our children. And so your kids are probably, hopefully, impacting and changing the culture of their friends. My daughters and my son are not allowed to date in high school because, and then when we say that, other parents are like, well, what do you mean? And it's like, well, how many of you were teenagers? Just by show of hands. You know what you wanted to do when you were a teenager. So why then would we allow them to go out on a date alone when we knew what we wanted to do? But try to do that in this day and people push back, but we did not care. You are not doing that. You can go out with your friends as a group. And so now when my daughter went to college, she's still a virgin. She's still, doing the things that we ask her to do because we tie her money to how she behaves. You don't behave in a way that we feel acceptable, then you out there on your own. Now she has told her friends that, and they actually joke about it. I know this, we gotta hurry up, but I just gotta tell you this quick story. So this is how we do it, because you have to do it one family at a time. So we say there's road A and there's road B. Honey, road A is you go to college, we're gonna pay for things. My daughter's right now in UK studying abroad, we pay for that. This road A is a great road. It's tree lined, it's paved, it's a good road. You wanna be on that road. Road B is, you made a mistake, you're gonna have some sex out of marriage or something, like you're gonna get pregnant. Okay, because road B is rocky. It's got potholes. We're going to love you anyway because Jesus loves us. But you don't want to be on that road. Trust me on that, because you're going to come home. You're going to go to communication. The whole thing, it's not going to be it. And so, they hear the story all their lives. So if my daughter goes to school, she tells her friends this, that my mother is crazy. She talked about road and road B, road A and road B. So then they went out somewhere and they asked her, so Olivia, are we going to be on road A or road B? This is college at the University of Maryland. So don't underestimate. And then if we get together in groups, we have, programs at our church where parents get together. It has to happen one family at a time, one child at a time, one friendship group at a time. We can't count on the media to do it because they're corrupted, to be honest. They think it's okay to shack up. When I write about stuff like this, you get all kinds of comments and criticisms that we're judgmental. We can't really just rely on them. We have to do it within our faith because they're just, they're faithless. I'm sorry, they just are.
I'm going to ask another question that this reminds me of, which is the political world. We talk about the media world and the political world. There's a story in the biography about Mrs. Obama that when she and Barack were dating, there was a conversation about whether really marriage was necessary, and she looked at whoever was bringing it up, and she said, "Marriage is everything." Right. And what I wonder is the president and his wife set a tremendously great example. But what I wonder about is that could there be more? I mean, a lot of what you all are saying is associated with the right of center politically, or more conservative viewpoints. And I find that when conservatives say those things, they're not reaching the people we really want to reach. How can we get the left on these issues? We can talk about government programs and spending and taxes, and they can say whatever they want. But on these issues, how do we get them to talk about these issues in the way that you two are?
I don't necessarily think that there is a neat division between talking about programs and spending and so on and so forth and these issues. President Obama has been criticized by high-profile left of center commentators about his language with African American audiences about family and marriage and responsibility and so on and so forth. These are things that Black politicians talk about in Black audiences. These are things that, again, churches, which are centers for Black politics, talk about with Black audiences. I think everyone can talk about these things more, but I'm not sure that more aggressive rhetoric here will make up for the fact that large numbers of low-income African American men just do not live in places where there is viable employment, and I feel like I'm obviously here I'm left of center, but it seems to me that there's the cultural piece here, but you can have Kendrick Lamar and Meek Mill talk about marriage all day, but that doesn't change the fact that West Baltimore is devoid of jobs or opportunity. And so I think fixing that part, from my view, you can maybe fixing that part doesn't ameliorate every problem, but it fixes a lot of them. And I think that is something that we can't lose sight of.
So I want to really question that, because in a recent forum, Isabel Sawhill referenced a study which showed that actually, and I am in favor of jobs for Black men, especially low-skilled jobs, especially low-skilled Black men. That's really an important structural goal. I'm 100% behind that. But I think we have to work on the cultural front as well. We have to do both, because the study she referenced was one which showed that even in a situation where they were able to impact the employment levels of these low-skilled Black men, it did not change the percentage of them who are married. Right. It actually didn't improve it. We have to do both, because what we've had is what sociologists like to call a path-dependent development. So yes, I do think the structural issues probably had a lot to do in precipitating the cultural changes that we've seen. But now these cultural changes have a life of their own, and simply reversing the structural conditions will not remediate the problem with marriage. We have to attack on both fronts. I mean, we have to see this as a fight, and we have to do both, really trying to change the structural situation, reducing mass incarceration, increasing jobs and income for Black men, while we are talking about this issue of changing the culture. So I agree. If we just have rappers singing or mothers talking about this, we will not get far. But we have to do both.
Brad, do you want to comment on that before we go to one more question?
I think it's a great note to go to another question.
Okay, all right. One more question from the audience. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Stephen Harris. I'm with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Really enjoyed the presentation. I guess my question, I'm hoping I can frame it in a coherent way. It's kind of tied to the last question that was raised. With a study like this, and I haven't engaged the work yet, but with a study like this, I guess I'm concerned about two different sides. One, an appeal to a kind of innate religiosity that really has no kind of distinctives, right? And so I feel like this work is really honing in on what is a reality that the Black church has produced because of its inherent makeup, because of the substance and the dynamism, if you use that word, of the teaching and the faith, particularly if I'm talking about a distinctly Christian perspective. And so I always want to guard against this kind of data being wielded in a sociological way to speak to just a religiosity in general, right? That these communities need to get back to or need to reflect some sense of religiosity that has been innate in them because it has produced these positive results. On the other hand, I think that it is true, and the last question reflected this, that a lot of these distinctives that we're talking about are what would be called conservative distinctives. And so the critique that the culture would give on a lot of what we're saying is that it's an appeal to a modern day respectability politics, right? It's kind of a notion of respectability that is metastasized far beyond what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham wrote about in Righteous Discontent at Harvard. And so I want to guard against those two things. So how can we talk about these positive benefits of faith life without appealing to just a broad religiosity, right? Well, people are just more, if you just be more religious and do religious things, because I don't think that's what anybody on the panel is talking about. I think they're talking about distinctive concepts, beliefs that have a transformative effect on the life, right? Not just I'm being religious. But on the other hand, how can we reflect these distinctives that we want to see without appealing to what I think is going to always get criticized in this current cultural context, which is where you're talking about respectability things, you're just talking about conservative principles. Basically, I'm asking, does the work reflect a very particular notion and understanding of faith that has produced these results, and not just religiosity in general? And that might be a question for the author of the book.
Yes.
Well, you know, in the sociology of religion, we have one tradition from Max Weber that would really talk about sort of the way in which distinctive traditions have distinctive effects. But we also have a tradition from Emil Durkheim talking about how religion in general tends to foster a certain kind of common morality. And I think your question in part is kind of getting at the Weberian point. And I would acknowledge that there are distinctive effects with different traditions, and we find some evidence in the book to that effect. But our more general story is more Durkheimian, that in general, you know, on the outcomes that we're looking at, religion tends to have a fairly positive effect across traditions and across racial and ethnic lines. So that would be one way of answering your question. On the respectability point, I think that's an important question that you're raising, because certainly, you know, as we talk about issues in terms of race today, there's often kind of a divide between those on the left who want to focus more on sort of social justice or racial inequality, and those on the right who kind of are in some ways, you know, sort of raising the issue of culture and this issue of respectability, or, you know, even self-reliance, in ways that put these two different kind of arguments in tension. And again, I think one of the things we're trying to stress in the book is the way in which they need not be in tension, and the way in which fostering, you know, as Reverend Calvin Butts does, you know, at Abyssinian in Harlem, sort of focusing both on social justice on the one hand, but also on an ethic of, you know, of decency or responsibility on the other hand, is necessary. That these two things go together. That changing the structure to, you know, echo one of Jamel's points, and changing the culture to sort of echo one of Jackie's points, these things are both required, you know, if we're going to make progress when it comes to racial justice in America. So what I'm saying is we think we have to sort of recognize that it's important, if we can, to kind of go beyond this debate that's been happening, obviously for decades, if not centuries, you know, when it comes to the sort of issue of racial justice in America, and recognize that both kind of changing the culture and changing the structures are important in making progress in racial justice.
Okay, that was a good way to finish. Thank you for that really outstanding question. And this conversation is going to continue after a short break, and we'll start with the second panel in about 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
So good to meet you, Michelle. Same here. I have to introduce you to the ministers. I think you'd really enjoy talking to them.
Yes.
They're doing a lot of the stuff that you're talking about.
And you know, such important work. And my son lives here in DC. I'll see if I can convince him to come visit you.
Oh, he would love it. He'd love it. It's very vibrant. Lots of
We're going to go ahead and get started here in a minute, so folks could sit down. That'd be great. Well, I'm going to introduce. Let me begin with brief introductions for our guests here at the second session. And I'd first like to acknowledge Helen Alvray, who's sitting over there at my far right. She's a professor of law at George Mason University, where she teaches family law, law, religion, and property law. She publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, and the First Amendment. She is the faculty advisor to the Law School Civil Rights Law Journal and the Latino Law Student Association, a consultor for the Pontifical Council of the Laity, and advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, among many other things. I also want to acknowledge Tony Suarez, who serves as the Executive Vice President of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference. The NHCLC is the nation's largest Hispanic Christian organization and seeks to reconcile evangelist Billy Graham's message of salvation with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s march of prophetic activism through its 7 directives of life, family, compassionate evangelism, stewardship, justice, education, and youth. We also have Ross Douthat joining us from the New York Times right now. It's on cue, it's wonderful. He's been an op-ed columnist in the New York Times since 2009. His column appears every Sunday, and he's the author of Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, so he's, I think, particularly qualified to speak here this morning. He's also the film critic for National Review. And then finally, my colleague, Nick Wolfinger, who is a professor of family and consumer studies and adjunct professor of sociology at the University of Utah. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD from UCLA. And his many books include Understanding the Divorce Cycle, The Children of Divorce and Their Own Marriages, and of course, our book together, Soulmates, which we'll be speaking about this morning. He's the author of more than 40 articles or chapters. He's also published in The Atlantic, The National Review, and The Huffington Post, among other outlets. And finally, I want to say it's just been a pleasure to work with Nick because we have very different takes on the world. He is a progressive. He's not married. He's childless, and he's pretty secular. And I'm obviously not any of those things. A point that he made actually in our preface to the book. So it's just, we live in a world where things are pretty polarized today in America. And it's been nice to work with someone who has a rather different take on things, as we've been trying to sort of figure out how it is that faith is influencing Black and Latino families. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking AAI for organizing this event, all the people participating in our session, the rest of our panel, and Brad for that polarizing introduction. In writing Soulmates, Brad was always the one who saw the big picture, while I'm much more concerned with the details. Consequently, he's already set the stage for this discussion this morning, so I don't have to do it. Let me start by showing that the retreat from marriage has been less consequential, less pronounced for Latinos than it has been for African Americans. As you can, the line is sort of hard to see, but if you look at the solid line on top, which depicts marriage rates for whites, you'll see a faint dotted line overlapping with it, and that's the trend for Latinos. So Latino and whites have been marrying at almost identical rates over the 40 years of our data. Marriage rates have declined for both, but the big decline and the big disparity is with African Americans. So the place the retreat from marriage is most pronounced among Latinos has been out of wedlock birth. And as you can see, really Latinos have seen the biggest gains in recent years in the rates at which they have children out of wedlock. Here, Latinos have become more like African Americans and less like whites. The trends for Latinos are rooted in what scholars have called the Latino paradox. And that's this. First-generation immigrants come to the United States and they have lower divorce rates, lower rates of single parenthood, less premarital cohabitation than do whites. And as they acculturate, subsequent generations then have increasing divorce rates, increasing rates of premarital fertility, more cohabitation until they come to resemble whites. So in other words, the family outcomes have changed for Latinos even as their incomes go up, as they get roots in this country and start to prosper. And so that's what we call the Latino paradox. It's a well-known feature of Latino demography, but to date, it's been applied, oddly enough, to medical research. Namely, as Latinos in this country become more prosperous, their health and acculturated, their health outcomes decline. So how can we explain the paradox, and why do Latinos resemble whites in marriage and divorce, but not so much when it comes to out-of-wedlock births? It's one of the challenges of our book, and the point I'll focus on today. So first, let's look at some background figures. Not a lot, because this is a short talk. When it comes to income, we've placed people in three groups, and you see the Latinos have incomes much more similar to African Americans than to whites. Indeed, Latinos and blacks are both concentrated in low-income groups. So overall, economically, Latinos look more like blacks than whites. So we can conclude from this that whatever makes Latinos and African Americans different when it comes to family outcomes must have cultural roots. So here are two slides in evidence of this contention, which reveal starkly different views in how Latinos, blacks, and whites view family. Okay, you've already seen this slide, but we liked it so much we had to include it again. Here you see that Latinos view marriage more positively than do blacks or African Americans. But the real difference is in this slide, and it concerns the emphasis on having children. And here, Latinos are several times as likely as African Americans or whites to think you gotta have kids. So there is a strong emphasis on starting a family among Latinos, and this may explain their high rates of non-marital fertility. They certainly value marriage, but children are so important that they won't wait for marriage before starting a family. A friend once told me the very moment he understood high Latino fertility. He saw a teenage Latina girl walking with her 5-year-old daughter. The mom was pushing a stroller with an infant in it, and her 5-year-old daughter was pushing a toy stroller with a doll in it. So there's a lot of socialization going on that's oriented towards familism. But that isn't the whole story. Money does play a big part. Sorry, the next slide. This slide just shows the gap, once more, the huge gap in non-marital fertility in this country between whites and everyone else. Money plays a big role. Here we've looked at the white Latino gap in non-marital fertility. So the blue bars show how much more likely Latinos are to have a child out of wedlock analyzing data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. This is a multi-year panel study. However, once we control for economic factors, income, education, employment history, we have eliminated a lot of the difference in premarital fertility. Money isn't the whole story either. Here we switch to the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent to Adult Health because it has good measures of culture. And we find that attitudes towards parenthood, towards non-marital fertility, can also explain a gap, part of the white Latino gap in having a child out of wedlock. So I want to point out parenthetically here that I'm offering a very bipartisan message. Both structure and culture can explain the family. So how is this family-oriented culture transmitted and received among Latinos? As Brad has already suggested, one big part of the story is the Latino church. Traditionally, this has been the Catholic Church, but a growing minority of Latinos, over 20%, are now evangelical Protestants. And as we can see, regular religious participation, going to church several times a month or more, reduces the chances of a non-marital birth among all Americans, including Latinos. So as my previous couple of slides suggested, part of these religious attendance effects can be explained by economic and cultural differences between people. In other words, church attendance is correlated with higher income and higher education, which themselves reduce the odds of a non-marital birth. Furthermore, religious attendance fosters the norms and values that encourage childbearing, but within the confines of marriage. And that's why we see regularly attending church services. And really, it doesn't matter too much which denomination it is. Makes it less likely that you will have a child out of wedlock. So this next slide presents a puzzle. Here we see the effects of religious participation on the odds of marriage. We've already noted that Latinos and whites marry at virtually identical rates. But with one exception, regular religious attendance makes marriage much more likely. And that's particularly true for Latino men. But the one exception is Latino women. And this is a puzzle we're not fully able to explain, but we have some good guesses. One of our speculations is that going to church regularly raises Latinas' expectations for their mates. Our data show that a recipe for unhappy relationships among Latinos is those couples in which the woman attends but the man doesn't. The gender gap also in substance abuse is greater for Latinos than members of any other demographic group. And Latinas have the lowest overall rate of substance abuse. So it's easy to see teetotaling Latinas who attend church regularly refusing to marry their bibulous, non-attending boyfriends. So we just suspect that Latinas who attend regularly come to have high expectations for their partners. And if their partners don't attend, those expectations are not always realized. Finally, we see, and this is a slide you already saw, that church attendance has a large effect on the happiness of all American relationships, including Latinos. This is true whether or not couples are married. For both live-in couples and married couples, attending church regularly makes your relationship happier. I'd also like to point out that the majority of Americans are happy with their relationships, whether or not they participate regularly in organized religion. So let me close with 3 broad points. First, the good news. Most Latinos and Latinas are doing great in their relationships. Second, except for non-marital births, Latinos and whites have similar family outcomes. And this is surprising because Latinos are much worse off economically than are whites. We're only left to think that if Latinos and whites had similar incomes, Latinos would have the strongest families in America, the highest marriage rates, the lowest divorce rates. And finally, the strength of Latino families in America can be explained in part by their long-standing culture of familism. And that's often supported in their communities by their religious participation. Thank you.
We're going to start with our conversation with Helen going ahead and offering a few minutes of observations about this subject. Thanks.
Thank you. This has been so interesting. I read the book line for line over many days, and I just loved it. I am someone who comes to you as an example of many of these trends. My mother warned me when I started college I would begin getting letters from my grandmother Carmen that would begin, "Have you found a man? Have you found him?" And that went all through law school. That your grandma, I've found a man. Okay, when will you be married? When are the babies coming? I'm like, you have 35 grandchildren. Give me a rest, right? There must be 34 others you can pick on starting soon. So the culture of children and familism is huge. I'm going to start by making one comment about family law and then 4 comments about my religious tradition in this and how it overlaps, which is Roman Catholicism. In family law, this book still does not fit within the mainstream, despite the fact that it should and that it's not partisan. Family law is really, really suspicious of religion and of marriage. It is very embracing of sexual expression, of relational choice among adults. It fears marriage because of its tendency to gender role, and it always links marriage with violence. In fact, you'll see, and my family law textbook does it, it overlaps the status intimate partner violence for violence in marriage, when actually the dramatic disproportion in intimate partner violence outside of marriage versus in. My book just describes it all to marriage. That's very typical of family law. So a book like this should be brought to bear on family law, but it's a hard nut to crack. 4 points on Roman Catholicism. This book, like my faith, comes from a place where it begins of respect and affection for the people it's studying. It should therefore find resonance with, my church, which has a firm grasp on the dignity of each person that it serves and the dignity of the families it's serving. So I think it is a model of constructive engagement with, I suspect, all Christian churches, because it begins with respect and affection and not with judgment. Second, this book's invitation comes at a time when my church is experiencing several things that are relevant. First, you may know, Pope Francis is in the news from time to time, that we're in a year of mercy, which I rightly suspect will be a theme with Pope Francis forever. Now, there are disagreements about its elements, but at the very least, it's a disposition toward persons that the church and each of us in the church is for people and with people in a concrete manner in their difficult and complex circumstances, seeks first to understand and then to be understood. And so that's a very positive disposition toward this message. Second, we're after the Synod on the Family, which said it was trying to grapple with the newish realities that are described: more premarital sex, cohabitation, diminished disapproval of non-marital sex, less marriage. The Synod talked again and again and again about the need for new language in the church and a push for pastoral engagement with people. Third, we have a pope whose every message about anything comes packaged with a side message that bishops and priests and all Catholics need to get away from their spreadsheets and into to groups of people, bringing with them their encounter with Jesus Christ. So great, okay, good setting. But I asked myself two questions. Will the church, can it respond as necessary? And I have two questions. One is the question about language. We've needed it for a while, a long time. John Paul II and Benedict did some fabulous and profound work on this. But Pope Francis is coming up on 3 years now, and he's been calling for it. And even though we have many wonderful things in the church, this ability to talk about things, and I could not have resonated more with the book's statement that Catholic churches do a lot on the Golden Rule on a Sunday and not a lot on some of the more difficult, neuralgic issues, even though I fully believe our pastors are capable of doing it in a way that is both sensitive and true. But I think in the context, which is not only in family law, but in culture, a profound pessimism that we can put the toothpaste back in the tube on cohabitation or non-marital sex or out-of-wedlock births, there just isn't enough discussing it. I think I'm reminded of this great book, I don't know how many of you have seen it, by the Paulist theologian Vincent Donovan, called Rediscovering Christianity, where he says, listen, the church is great. He's referring to the Roman Catholic Church, where he experienced it in Africa among the Maasai. He says, we're fabulous about social services, and we really are. And he said, but we have a little bit more trouble putting things into language that people can understand. And he did an experiment where instead of just doing these large-scale social services in his community in Africa, he asked to go out and speak to the Maasai in the cultural language that they could understand about the gospel, as St. Paul did, and had, for the first time in his order's history, success with evangelization. So I think we need something like that, to talk from people's experience up about the fact that, God could have put children anywhere, but somehow they're at the intersection of the man and the woman at sex. Somehow children really do better when they have a long, stable connection with their mother and their father. And bring this up toward the Christian theology of the sacrament of marriage, where grace is real and God will step in and help you. And bring it up toward the understanding that scriptures say that marriage is a unique place for representing God's love for God's people. I think that can be done, but we haven't. The final point is, I wonder if there's the reward structure in a parish or a diocese to do this. And I think you all know what I'm talking about, right? People respond to reward structures. Is it in the reward structure of a particular priest, a particular group of lay leaders, a particular bishop, to spend this kind of time on the family? Or are there other reward structures going on in the church? Pope Francis has been asking about these, and trying to dismantle the wrong reward structures. One final note I'd add is, in addition to some of the ideas you had in your book, on the ground, we found, for instance, that having Latino men in particular involved in the Knights of Columbus, where they're serving other people, is actually a big key into bringing people closer into the church. It's been a great institutional mechanism. And with regard to women, a program maybe some of you know called Endow, Educating on the Nature and Dignity of Women, where we didn't intend it, but it turns out when women come together and talk about the church's fabulous teachings on the actual dignity of women, they end up moving their cohabiting relationships into marriage as an unexpected part of their renewed engagement with God and with the church. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. In the church, we teach that the gospel of Jesus Christ, when rightfully applied to your life, will change every aspect of your life: your money, your marriage, your education, and of course your spirituality. I'm the son of a pastor, and my grandparents were pastors, so 3 generations in the church. This is all I've ever known. I preached to my stuffed animals when I was 4 and 5 years old, and baptized Wonder Woman and Superman, and prayed. Superman had a bout with kryptonite. I prayed for him, and God miraculously healed him in the basement of my house in Chicago. And I grew up around this, and I don't have that moment in my life where I can say I was called to the ministry. It was something that I just felt even from being a child. And in that, my father, whether right or wrong, allowed me to sit in a lot of meetings in his office, to the point where even at 10, I'd say, Dad, I got an opinion on that that issue going on in that family. And so I was around this a lot. Hispanic families, evangelical families, there's this, when you come into the church, there's a word that is used, and some use it as a poison word. It's actually a good word. There's this word called conviction. As they join the church, conviction comes into their life. It comes into every aspect of their life. And as conviction comes through the power of the Holy Spirit, through the Word of God, through the teaching of the Bible, they're now convicted about lifestyles and decisions that they've made in the past. And so as a pastor, when I moved to Virginia, I pastored a church that was 67% undocumented immigrant, first generation, primarily made up of Central Americans. And it was an overarching theme that when people would come talk to me, the ladies would tell me, I've had children out of wedlock in Central America. I had a husband of some sort in Central America. Now I live in the United States. I haven't seen that man for 12, 14 years, and now I'm in I've started another family, but I don't know where that other man is. I don't know how to divorce. I don't know how to fix what I left behind. And then there's this conviction that can turn into condemnation, where they feel so bad for what they've done. They think there's no mercy and no forgiveness. And so we work out through those cycles. And this is actually a major issue within the Latino church of rectifying some of these issues. I would say that in the Latino world, mothers are valued, as even some of your research, just having children. There's so many songs about madrecitas and about your mother. Yet outside of mothers, many females are viewed more as a sexual object to Latino men. And so these young ladies grow up with these men that are their boyfriends or whatever it might be in school, that are just looking at them for one thing and one thing only, and it's sex. And so these young ladies begin to have children, and things happen. And there's the D word, and we won't cuss today. I'm a Pentecostal preacher, but the D word in the Latino culture is divorce. To a fault, if I can put it that way. And I know that'll sound strange. Maybe let's not quote me on that. To a fault. Men can do what they want, say what they want, act however they want, and there's no consequence. There is no divorce because we value marriage. So I'm going to not fix the marriage. I'm going to ignore the actions of what's taking place. I'm going to ignore the infidelity. I'm going to ignore what's going on. And so young ladies are growing up watching their mothers live through abuse and live through infidelity, and assuming that this is the way it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to be in this regardless of what happens. And then what takes place is they move to the United States and they become culturalized, or a word we don't use anymore, assimilated into American culture. And now American culture compared to Latino culture, it doesn't gel. American culture says, no, you don't have to be a product of, you don't have to be the victim of abuse. You don't have to sit through infidelity. And so now there's that. So you find these young ladies that grew up, as they said, their goal is, I'm going to be a mom. I would even use as a point of reference growing up in the church. And my mother is white. She's Irish from Chicago. She was a missionary to Colombia. My father is Colombian. And so I grew up hearing both perspectives, Latino and white. So I have to sometimes, flip my white switch and then my Latino switch, and, the way I think. But I remember growing up in church, something that was interesting is that the young white girls in church were playing with American Girl dolls. The Latino girls were playing with their little baby brothers and sisters. They were changing diapers when they were 6 and 7. They're not playing with baby dolls. They're actually holding the baby. They're burping the baby. They're giving the bottle. They're feeding the baby. They're from a very young age. The I don't know if this is the right word. I feel I'm trying to use big words with all the education in the room, but the motherly, if that's not a word, let's start that. But these motherly instincts within them just start sprouting up, but at a very young age. Now I'm the father of a daughter who's 8 years old. I'm trying to suppress any kind of motherly instinct. I'm like, no, honey, let's go play something else. I want that to be a long time in the future. Yet it's celebrated in Latino women even from a young age. The church, the fastest growing segment of Christianity of all flavors is the Latino church. And as the gospel is applied to their life, we do see the changes. We do see the value of marriage. But even in the value of marriage, I would say that there's this stark contrast from the United States. When I married my wife, this was about her day. And my mother-in-law, God bless her, and God have mercy on her. She reminded me constantly, this is about Jessica. This isn't about you. You're going to show up, but this is about my daughter. And they thankfully also footed the bill for the wedding. And this is about my wife. This is about Jessica. In the Latino culture, the bride's family doesn't pay for the wedding. This isn't so much about the bride as it is the man. I'm going to get me a wife. I'm going to have me a family. There's that contrast. And even within the church, you'll find that still exists. So teaching the value of marriage, a lot of Latinos believe, especially, and I'm using as my point of reference, Central Americans, which is who I pastored mostly here in Virginia, have this notion, and some of it is because of the government structures from where they came from and how difficult it is to marry. There's a civil wedding, and then there's the religious ceremony. There are a lot of there would be many that would come to me and say, "Well, I am married, Pastor. I don't need to have a wedding." And we'd talk through the ceremony. They'd say, "No. I'm taught that when I consummate with them, that's marriage before the eyes of God." And some of this came during, like for Nicaraguans, during the time of the Sandinistas, or in El Salvador, when in the middle of the Civil War, it was difficult for evangelicals to get married. So they were almost, there was secret ceremonies, if you would, within the church. And it was said, well, if you've consummated the marriage, be faithful to that person, and you're now married in the eyes of God. And therefore, this notion of I have to get married was not as important as it might be to Latino Americans. So that's what I would share without rambling.
Well, I will ramble. Sorry. But first, I'll turn on my microphone. Thank you so much for having me. And I was going to say that I'm very pleased that this book has finally been written. I remember, honestly, as a political columnist, your job is basically to find scholars whose work you can ruthlessly cannibalize for your own purposes. And I remember distinctly having a coffee with Brad, must have been four or 5 years ago, and it was actually before I wrote my last book, which was also a ruthless cannibalization of real scholars. And he promised that he was going to do all this fascinating work on family and religion in Black and Hispanic communities, and then it just, it didn't appear, and he did other things instead, and it's been a terrible burden, speaking again as a columnist, to wait and wait. So I'm glad it's finally here. Thank you, Brad. Burdens of newspaper writing. But seriously, this is a wonderful, rich, fascinating book and project, and we're very, very fortunate to have it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is one of the interesting implicit themes that emerges from Brad and Nick's research, which is the idea that there's we have a lot of debates in American politics and culture that are about moral issues, values issues, and so on, with social conservatives like myself making arguments about moral decline, and social liberals making arguments about moral progress, and so on. And that tends to lead to these sort of easy binaries where things are either getting better or they're getting worse, and there's sort of different models, and you're either progressing towards a good model or progressing away from a good model, and so on. And I think what you see in the research in this book is that, of course, human life is much more complicated than that, and cultures can sort of find stability in a lot of different ways and places, and they can also find instability in a lot of different ways and places. And as one of the token white people on today's panels, it's interesting to think about this in terms of some of the data on white mortality rates, particularly white working class mortality rates, that's come out and been debated and discussed over the last couple months, including there was a big piece in my own New York Times a couple of days ago looking at heroin addiction in working class white communities and so on. And one of the fascinating things with some of that research, especially when you combine it with some work that Brad and others have done, is that what you find in the white working class right now is a kind of social collapse that isn't apparent in Black and Hispanic communities. So these mortality rate trends that people are talking about, this rise in mortality rates for less educated whites, doesn't show up in the data for African Americans and Hispanics. African Americans do have higher mortality rates overall white Americans, but the trend for African Americans has been positive and has remained positive for some time, even as working class whites have suddenly started dying in larger numbers. And that trend is probably connected in certain ways to the effects of religion on social structures, and how exactly it's connected is obviously a complicated debate. But one of the interesting things is that you see a similar pattern with religion, where over this period of sort of increasing white working class disarray, you've had a sharp decline in church-going and religious participation among working class whites that, again, doesn't show up for Hispanics or for the black church. Hispanics and blacks have patterns that, again, track with sort of broader trends in American society as a whole, but don't show that kind of steep social disintegration. And all of this is a little bit unmoored from specific economic trends, because, of course, working class blacks and working class Hispanics have been hit hard in various ways by the Great Recession, for instance, in the same way that working class whites have been. Working class blacks and Hispanics have, again, lower incomes, lower wages on average than white people, working class white people. And yet, again, you have this particularly negative trend among whites that doesn't show up in the same ways among blacks and Hispanics. And I think what you see there, arguably, and this is just going to be speculation on my part, but hopefully informed speculation, is that there is, you have different matrices, different complexes of how attitudes towards work, family, religion, and life in general fit together. And what you're seeing among working class white Americans right now is a collapse of what was a very effective matrix for a very long time, where even for people who weren't technically bourgeois, who weren't fully middle class, you had this sort of bourgeois nexus where, marriage was linked to church going, was linked to work, was linked to upward mobility, was linked to family, and so on. And as long as the jobs were there and the sort of religious attitudes fit with the social attitudes and so on, the complex worked reasonably well. Whereas in the African American community, for instance, that kind of complex maybe arguably existed 50 or 60 years ago, but over the course of the 60s and 70s, with this much sharper breakdown in the black family, that kind of complex sort of fell apart. And so African American churches seem to adapt in certain ways to that reality. And I think you see this in the book's data, where African American churches have a different attitude towards sex, marriage, and out-of-wedlock births than do a lot of, let's say, conservative white Protestant churches. That is, there's still a clear connection between church-going and family stability and so on, although not completely and not on every front. But the black church has adapted to the reality that lots of people in its pews are unmarried, likely to remain unmarried, have children out of wedlock, maybe divorced, and so on. And it has found its way, in an interesting way, to a model that is, for all its problems, arguably more workable than the sort of broken matrix or increasingly broken matrix in white working class communities. And that's arguably why, even though African American communities are beset by some of the same problems that white working class communities are beset by, they aren't leading to this sort of spike in drug addiction, suicide, drift away from community, and despair that's been manifest in the white working class. So you have this, and I'm probably not phrasing this idea completely, in the ideal way, but I think the point is that there are certain things in a way that, precisely because of the particular struggles of the African American experience, that African American communities are better adapted in certain ways to some contemporary dislocations than white working class communities are. And in that sense, arguably, white working class communities could probably, and people who are pastoring in those communities and so on, can learn something from the experience of the black church. And then what's interesting too is that Latino and Hispanic America seem to be on their own track that combines elements of the black experience, elements of working class white experience, with the distinctive role of being recent immigrants and having a different set of expectations. And expectations here, I think, is sort of a fascinating and sort of understudied part of social stability. The expectations that you have as a Black American, given the history of Black people in this country, is going to be very different from the expectations that working class whites have. And those expectations, in turn, are going to be different from the expectations that someone who comes here from Central America is going to have. So even if each person has technically the same income, technically the same religious affiliation, technically the same marital stresses, the weight of their cultural background is going to push them maybe towards optimism, maybe towards resignation, maybe towards despair, and the social trends that result will be very, very different. So that's one point, and then very briefly, I would make a second point, which is that there's what you might call demoralization, right? This sort of breakdown of moral and social structures that we're seeing particularly sharply in the white working class right now. There's a kind of cultural stability that I think arguably you can see in the African American community, certainly relative to where things were 20 or 30 years ago. The big spike in out-of-wedlock birth rates among African Americans has leveled off in certain ways. You don't have huge changes in church attendance and so on. But then there's the question of how you get from that kind of stability to a better place. How do you do remoralization? And this is what I think both of the panels today have been talking about. And it's a particular challenge because communities adapt to social breakdown in ways that are in certain ways healthy and necessary, right? It's healthy and necessary that, that when you're counseling women who have come from Central America, who have, a family there and a family here and are trying to make the transition and so on, that you aren't just like, well, you're a sinner with a failed marriage, get the heck out of my church, right? I mean, there's nothing Christian about that and also nothing socially beneficial about that. But at the same time, if you become too adapted to those realities, you essentially end up just, you have a faith community or any kind of community that sort of shrugs at trends like the rising out-of-wedlock birth rate among Latinos that are probably bad news long-term for those communities. And this is something I think that Francis-era Catholicism, to sort of end where Helen began, is really struggling with. And I think it's not a coincidence that Francis Jorge Bergoglio comes out of the Latin American experience, where you have this particularly high rate of out-of-wedlock birth rates, this sort of distinctive respect for marriage that coexists with people not getting married in certain ways precisely because they respect marriage so much. It's like, well, their relationship isn't there, or the social situation isn't there, or the political situation isn't there, and so people end up in common law marriages and so on. And the question for religious communities is, well, what do you do when you have that kind of disrupted, non-ideal reality? How do you combine understanding, mercy, with a moralism that encourages people to get to a better place? And I think in certain ways, the evangelical Pentecostalist wing of sort of Latino religion in the U.S. is managing this more effectively than Catholicism, which is, and I think this shows up in certain ways in some of the research we've been talking about, where people go to Mass on Sunday and never hear anything practical about family life or anything else in some parishes. And the advantage that I think evangelical and Pentecostalist churches have is that they combine this. Catholicism in certain ways can end up with the worst of both worlds. You have priests who don't preach about these issues, so there's no sort of granular how to live your life presence discussion and so on, but then the church still has these very strict rules around divorce and remarriage and so on, which have obviously been up for a great deal of debate in the Francis era. And so you have people who get no guidance in the everyday, and then suddenly they, are confronted with the fact that the church considers your first marriage valid, and you don't know how to get an annulment and so on, and so it's sort of this sort of punitive side that doesn't have a pastoral side before you get there, whereas the sort of lower sacramentalism of, and I mean lower in a non-pejorative way, the sort of low church attitudes of evangelicals and Pentecostals mean you can be a little more forgiving of sort of prior situations, but then that's combined with a much stronger, at least on the evidence that we have and that I've seen in my own life, a much stronger sort of everyday moralism in religious communities. And that combination seems to work better than what American Catholicism has going right now. But I think that's the sort of distinctive challenge that's particular to Black and Latino communities right now, that there is in certain ways a greater stability in this sort of more fragmented landscape, that Black churches and Latino churches are more adapted to a sort of post-sexual revolution, post-1970s economic landscape world. But then the challenge is, how do you treat that stability as a foundation for moral progress rather than just something where, you just accept that 70%, 50% of births are out of wedlock and you sort of live in community in that sense? How do you get from stability to progress? So I've rambled enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross, as well for your remarks. And actually, you've set us up well, I think, for the question that I wanted to begin our sort of larger conversation on, and that is, and I'll ask this, anyone can jump in on this question, starting with Nick. And do you think it's the case that sort of Latino Protestant churches are actually doing a better job on the ground serving Latino families, on average, than is the Catholic Church? And I say this as a Catholic. And if so, why is that the case? So I'll start with Nick and then go to our two guests to my right.
What I'd like to point out are the results of a paper I published with the sociologist Chris Ellison a couple of years ago, in which we contrasted evangelical Latinos with Catholic Latinos. And what we found is more traditional values and more conservative values among the evangelical Latinos than the Catholic Latinos on just about every measure we could come up with. Towards marriage, towards single parenthood. So I don't know how this is translating into action on the ground by clergy in evangelical churches. So I'd like to hear from our panel, if you guys have any insight.
There is we're not supposed to admit it, but we say that Catholics make good evangelicals, good Pentecostals, and I think one of the things to look in that study, because the Catholic Church does teach a strong sense of family, value of marriage. What you have in the Latino culture is that there are a lot of cultural Catholics. There is a major difference between cultural and practicing Catholics within the Latino community. To dispel any sense that the evangelical and Catholic Church at this massive competition for who gets the bigger piece of the Latino pie.
But we do.
No, but practicing Catholics compared to culture, that's where there is a difference. And there was something I wanted to jump in after as I was hearing you speak. The divorce, when I said it's the D word, within the Protestant church, especially amongst the Pentecostal church, there's these strands of legalism where you're taught if you ever divorce, you can never remarry. So it elevates it to this higher level of, why would I want to make a decision that I can never go back on? I can if I can just be I can mess up, I can sin and still get grace. I can get forgiveness, but if I get married, I'm stuck. I can never right the ship again. Well, if that's the case, why would you? I mean, you would wait until you are really sure. And that is one of the issues that we see in the Protestant church.
It's a huge question. There's a couple things I would bring in. One, the level of discourse in Catholic theology about sex and marriage and parenting that is put out by Benedict or John Paul II in particular is astonishing in its brilliance and clarity. I just think it's objectively true. It's amazing for those who have actually bothered to read things like the entire series of the Theology of the Body, or even when Benedict gets interviewed as Ratzinger or Pope Benedict, what he can communicate off the cuff, clearly, fully, that reason and faith intertwining at every moment is stunning. I think, however, that has not been captured in a language that ordinary people can grasp. Now, Francis, if anyone bothers to read his audiences on the family from, say, January through to when he came to the United States, he is attempting to capture things in a more user-friendly way, if you will, more ordinary person. And so he says in his April message, really most people's experience of the most intense, close, permanent, faithful, fruitful relationship is just as St. Paul described. It's going to be marriage. And he says, I think the crisis in marriage is a crisis beginning in faith. And I think the crisis of marriage is causing a crisis of faith, and now they are feeding off of one another. So he's saying what 120 pages of the translation of the Theology of the Body said. He's trying, but we have to do a lot better. A second point, I think, and I was struck so much by Michelle Singletary's wonderful point. I used to say, if you don't say it, Oprah will. And I don't know, if we don't say it, Oprah will. If we don't say it, Ricky Lake will. If we don't say it, Stephen Colbert will. Someone will. I don't understand why we lack boldness when we know we're confronting such boldness on the other side. When I was in charge of communicating for the Catholic bishops for 10 years in the 90s, I did not make that mistake, I think. And so I would testify on abortion, and someone would talk about the great harm to women of, being mothers and the difficulty. And I was pregnant a lot, and I would say, I'm sitting here pregnant and you're calling me disabled. I would just sort of hand it back. And I think we too infrequently are as bold as what's confronting us. And I don't understand why. I understand that it happens. I worked in the church, and we are genius at services, at non-judgmental services. The Crisis Pregnancy Center movement, we flipped the number of abortion clinics and crisis pregnancy centers. You realize that, right? There were as many abortion clinics in the 70s as there are crisis pregnancy centers now, and abortion clinics have dropped, right? We've been genius at offering services. But I experienced in the church as an employee, sometimes a desire so hard to be kind and nice that we failed to also give, the hard truth. And that was just my experience as an employee. And it's also been my experience sometimes as a parishioner of wonderful parishes, but that we haven't got that balance down. And that's several reactions to that thought.
Are there new sort of pastoral approaches or messages that you have seen in particular churches or programs that you think would be effective or are effective in addressing kind of these unique dynamics that we've been talking about today? Tony, let's start with you on that question.
I'd say that the Hispanic church is copying, if you would, what's happening at Michelle's church, making marriage a priority, making sure that we have family pastors, marriage pastors, that there is more than just marital counseling, but there's, if I can use this word, a sense of a coach. There's someone walking alongside of you trying to coach the marriage, and that's taking place throughout the entire evangelical movement. Yeah.
Sometimes it's ironic because people think of the Catholic Church as, monolithic and so forth, but it's actually a giant federalist system, diocese by diocese, if you really think about it. And so I couldn't possibly summarize for you the differences between the thousands of dioceses in the world, but they're there. We have everything from dioceses that probably don't do much to dioceses that have fabulous, young adult programs where they talk about this stuff early, like the church that Michelle is talking about and the couple is here representing. We have parishes and dioceses that have marriage mentors. And, you meet with these young couples in the early years or have mentoring for parenting. We have dioceses which have none. We have a wonderful program. The USCCB has a website for your marriage. There are marriage prep programs, which I love, but I constantly ask the question, What about all those Catholic schools with the ability to talk to kids beginning to when they're young? Why aren't we doing remote preparation? I have vast experience in the Catholic schools with myself and my own kids, and I can't really figure out why we don't have remote preparation about marriage. So there's some great stuff, and there's some huge gaps that are stunning.
I'd like to reiterate a point we make in the book over and over, and that all of our observations of churches across America show a lot of cultural sensitivity to the reality on the ground. In these parishes, there are many single parents. There are many unmarried couples living together. And so pastors have recognized this reality and have sought to bring these people into the church. So I'm wondering, and indeed there are benefits, as our analysis shows, whether or not couples are married, they do better when they participate in organized religion. So I'm curious how our churches can speak to these parishioners.
No. No, I really.
Oh, you don't- you
no,
really don't?
I was being perfectly sincere.
Oh.
I don't have. No, I mean, I imagine that you have more insights than I do. Is the best way of putting it.
Again, making the gospel practical to our parishioners and teaching them as they come into the church. Many revere the Bible and again, this will sound almost strange for me to say it. They revere the Bible to a fault, to the point where they don't believe they can read it, that someone else must interpret it for them, and that someone else must explain this. And when you say, no, you can read that.
No, that's true. That's correct.
He's
He's called the Pope.
I was on an airplane coming to New York from Peru, and the lady sitting next to me saw me. She saw me reading my Bible, and not because I'm holy and all. It's just I was gonna preach. I had to read. I was getting inspired for what I was gonna do when I got to New York. And she said, "Sir, are you reading a Bible?" I said, "Yes, I am." And long story short, she said, "I wish I could read mine." She said, "I have one." Pulled it out, it's wrapped in the plastic. And I said, "Ma'am," and I wasn't being sarcastic, smart aleck. I said, "You ought to get it out of you ought to read it." She said, "Oh, no, I'm not holy enough. If you knew my life, if you knew what I've done," and the Pentecostal in me stirs up and says, "Oh, if you knew my life too." I mean, that's the whole power of it. That if you knew who you're sitting next to, you'd change your seat too. But there's this I don't know, but when we make it practical and we say the gospel changes these different aspects of your life, and I can show you, and in that informal setting of being able to say, look, this is how God changes this and does this. And Jesus taught through parables. This is for me the complexity of preaching. Some people are nervous to go to church because they say, well, the sermon is going to go over my head and I'm not going to understand the these and the thous and the thou shalt nots. That's not how Jesus preached in his time. He was relevant to his culture, and he told stories that made sense. Jesus was a storyteller. So when I want to communicate the power of the gospel to the people that come and will listen to me, I'm not going to tell stories that they can't relate to. I tell relational stories that make sense in this culture. They might not understand Daniel and the lion's den. They might not understand Samson and Delilah, but when I can say, listen what happened to me 2 weeks ago on the metro here in Washington, D.C. And listen, all of a sudden things make sense. And that is the power of the gospel, that it makes sense and it can be applied. It's practical to any geographical location, to any culture, and any time in history.
I would add a couple of things. One, the example in your book, whichever of you wrote it, about the pastor who accompanied a young couple from, I think, cohabitation and non-marital parenthood through to marriage. I'm a huge fan of Pope Francis' admonition to engage in direct pastoral engagement. I don't have the silver bullet idea. Maybe something like in Italy where they have, a bishop every 4 square miles so that they have less bureaucracy and more hands-on with the various parishes and people. When I was asked by America Magazine to review the Relatio going into the Second Synod on the Family, what do you think about it? I said, it's a fabulous wish list from the highest level for the church at the local level. And God help the church at the local level figuring out how to get all this done, because it involved this enormous amount of personal encounter, personal labor, one-on-one work. I think, number one, there's no substitute for that. I have another idea that is more specific. I mentioned at the end of my talk this program called Endow, Educating on the Nature and Dignity of Women. And I think it might be a piece of, Nick, what you set up at the end, which is why is it that these, very highly attending church Latinas are really not much influenced in the way of marriage. And I think it's not just that they have very high standards for the men and are looking around saying, what can we find? I think it's that they don't have high enough standards for themselves. And I think one of the things I suggested, the woman who founded Endow, Terry Polakovic, a woman in Denver, it's now being run by Martha Reichert. It's in dozens and dozens of dioceses. It brings church documents on women, the letter to women in '95 that JP2 sent to the UN, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the collaboration of men and women, all these great docs. And the women read it, and they bring it now into prisons. They bring it into working poor and poor communities that are all minority. And it's really moving. I mean, there are communities of completely unchurched women in prison, or women who are of every color and various religious denominations, who are so moved by these words about their value. And again, they just reported anecdotally, as the leaders of these discussion groups got together, they said, wow, and 30 to 40% of these women in what you call the consensual unions and these cohabiting unions are moving to marriage. And I think that maybe part of the deal is they now think they're worthy of it, that I deserve a commitment from you. So I wonder if, especially in the Latino community, assisting women to understand their essential dignity is part of the answer.
Let me open up the floor to questions that people might have here for our panel. Any questions here? Yes, you, sir, in the back.
Here's the mic. Thanks. Wondering how prevalent you think the model of, say, Marco Rubio is. As I understand, Rubio attends a Catholic service, but then also very much is committed to an evangelical church as well. So my anecdotal sense of things is that that blending is becoming quite prominent. Having children sacramentalized into the church, but then also attending on a more frequent basis evangelical or Pentecostal church. So just wondering if the authors have a sense of how prevalent that is.
I don't think we do, but you would have, Tony, to some extent about, are people blending, or are they pretty much staying in one church, when it comes to sort of week in, week out?
There, as has been noted and found in a lot of research, there is a growing number of Catholics that have come into the evangelical church, but the phenomenon in the United States that maybe is causing the blending is the charismatic Catholic Church, where it's now the blend of both, and you don't have to leave one to have the other, and that is a very interesting study in itself.
But and there is, I think, definitely, this is true in Latin America, certainly, as sort of in culturally Catholic settings, the phenomenon of, the churches where you go to get these sort of life cycle sacraments, you get baptism, you get confirmation, you get married there, and so on. It seems like that sort of cultural Catholic attitude where you're not in Mass every Sunday, you're at Mass and Christmas and Easter, it lends itself to that kind of blending where, you're, especially since Pentecostal and evangelical tend to do more church shopping and church hopping overall. So, to be honest, I sort of had this experience in my own childhood early on where I was baptized Episcopalian, and we were sort of raised Episcopalian and went to Episcopal churches when we went to church on Sundays, but then my parents were also involved in sort of charismatic groups and so on, where we never had a sort of stable congregation necessarily, or we had one temporarily, but that was in certain ways the focus of my family's religious life. And I think that pattern is relatively rare among upper middle class white people. It seemed to be relatively rare when I was a kid, but I would not be surprised if it was a lot more common, especially among Latinos.
You, ma'am, right there.
I guess I'm a little confused. Are you, on the whole, optimistic or are you pessimistic? Do you think that, because I'm Latina, I'm from Venezuela, and I see what's going on in Latin America, I see what is going on here, you hear the numbers, you look at the data, and I tend to be pessimistic. But do you guys, I mean, are you overall optimistic about, the role of these churches, and are they making a dent in what normally we would see as a more pessimistic scenario?
Are you Catholic or Protestant?
I'm Catholic.
Then I would be a little more pessimistic. I mean, but in all seriousness, I think that what's happened. This is particular to the Latino Hispanic experience, but basically Catholicism in general, but especially I'd say Latin American Catholicism, has not yet adapted successfully to the twin realities of secularization and the sexual revolution on the one hand, and actual sustained competition from evangelical and Pentecostal churches on the other hand. And until that adaptation happens, I would expect Catholicism in Latin America to continue to decline somewhat, which it already has, and I would expect Latino Catholicism in the U.S. to be weaker than it should be, and more of, and to see these kind of trends that you see in this data, where if you're looking for the strongest families, the most stable communities among immigrants in the U.S., you're more likely to find them among converts to evangelical and Pentecostal churches. So I think there's a big challenge there for the Catholic Church. Now, if you're doing the macro level picture where we don't care about denominational differences or, whether the Pope interprets the Bible for us and so on, that's a joke. It's a joke, sort of. On the macro level picture, I think I'm not at all sure, and I think your sort of uncertainty from these presentations is appropriate. I think that particularly for, again, the Latino experience, you have this, this sort of sense that things could go in a lot of different directions. That you could, you have sort of areas of Latino life in the U.S. where it looks like it's downward assimilation, basically. That sort of Latino paradox ends up in its worst place, where you have sort of second and third generations assimilating basically to the white working class, this sort of collapsing white working class situation. But you also have the reality that in many ways, Latino communities are literally healthier than anyone else in the U.S. The physical health of Latinos in the U.S. is one of these fascinating artifacts of social science that no one can quite explain, but are also healthier in sort of community, religious, and so on in all kinds of different ways. And so that lends reasons for optimism, basically. But I think, to go back to my initial rambling point, the danger of sort of this optimism versus pessimism binary is that there are lots of different ways for cultures to work. And I think in the African American and Latino experiences in the U.S., you see a lot of different models of sort of stable working cultures that don't map onto the sort of white Anglo model of 1955 style stability. And the question is sort of, what are the trajectories of those communities for the future?
I'll be slightly more ecumenical than Ross was and observe that in our book we consider numerous outcomes. There are all the family outcomes that we've been discussing for the past couple hours: marriage, relationship quality, out-of-wedlock childbearing, really consequential things. And then there's a myriad of social outcomes: employment, substance abuse, domestic abuse, infidelity in relationships. And virtually across the board, religion produces benefits. So in this respect, there is some good news. It's not all good news, but religion really seems to be a force for good the vast majority of the time for our respondents.
And I want to be clear that I, as a Catholic, in many ways, I regard the success of evangelical and Pentecostal churches not just as a threat to Catholicism, but as a very, very good thing in its own right. And the pressure that these churches are putting on the Catholic Church to do a better job is the kind of pressure that Catholicism should welcome. I think the broad sort of pan-American story in certain ways will be determined by whether, in many ways, the positive impact of sort of Pentecostalist and evangelical churches can counter the negative late modern trends towards social dissolution. And Catholicism is sort of in this juncture point between the two as sort of the ancestral religion that's struggling to adapt. And if it adapts successfully, in part by learning from our Protestant brothers and sisters, then the broader story will take a more positive turn.
I would say I'm optimistic, and I'm going to use that for not only just because I'm a evangelical who's supposed to be optimistic every day and say this is the day that the Lord hath made, but because I'm a witness. I bear witness to the testimony of the people that have come into the church in these different situations that we've said that they've come from, and we've seen them get married, and we've seen them begin to grow strong families. And again, it reemphasizes, and I feel like a broken record now, but when the gospel is rightfully applied to their life, we see the change. I used to think, well, how can I speak when I'm only speaking from 3 different pastorates that I've had? But in case studies, sometimes you're interviewing or surveying, maybe it might be a dozen people or a few hundred people. So I'll put it this way, I'm going to call my pastorates my case studies. In my 3 case studies of pastoring in Chicago and in Virginia, I have seen the power, the transformational power of the Lord Jesus Christ when it is applied to their lives. And therefore, it makes me optimistic, and it encourages me that I need to keep preaching this message because it will bring change.
How about one more question, and then we'll wrap things up. Let's see. Michelle Singletary.
Yeah, I get that. I actually have a 2-part question. Brad and Nick, how would you want churches to use your research, and do you expect that they will? Because oftentimes this kind of thing comes out and it's quoted by other researchers, and it never really gets to the body that could say this is why this is successful. That's the first part. And can I go, Oscar, just a little bit, since we have 2 pastors here who work with thousands of folks really at our church, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, I would love, if it's okay, to ask Skip, are you optimistic or pessimistic about what they've been talking about? Is that all right?
Sure. Why don't we go with Skip, and then I'll just end on concluding that with you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, good morning. I find the book interesting. I went out and just bought 3 of them right here. Because it validates what we've been doing, what we've been successfully doing. And I was trying to process how can our success translate into the Latino community, translate into the white community. And I think what we do a good job of, which you all described, is stabilizing the person in Christ so they have stable relationships. And from those stable relationships, they have stable responses. And from those stable responses, the common denominator between the white church, the Latino church, and the African American church is the dollar. And once you have a stable relationship, stable responses, stable employment, stable giving, then the church can be about the business of the church, is spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think that's the common to me, that's the common denominator, is this, if we stabilize them based upon the ever-changing responses that we experience in relationships, we make better choices that please culture and please God.
I can answer this in 2 words: more ministries. Just as Michelle has described in her church, that's a great example of the marriage ministry you guys are doing, but churches can involve their parishioners in new and innovative ways to have ministries that focus on employment. We talk about this at the book. Ministries that focus on relationships, and ministries that are culturally sensitive. Brad came up with a great example that we talk about in the conclusion of the book. In Seattle, there's a men's ministry where the pastor speaks to his parishioners they watch Monday Night Football, and then the pastor addresses them at halftime. This is a men's ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And so all sorts of things like this to transform religion from just a once-a-week experience to something that's much more integrated in the lives of the members, and as Tony pointed out, in a language they can understand in practical ways.
So I would certainly echo what Nick has just said, and I would say in terms of our objectives, in terms of the book, Michelle, I think that there are really 2 things we're trying to do. One is to underline, a positive portrait, as we've done today, that talks about the ways in which churches, Catholic and Protestant, are advancing a kind of a positive message and agenda for many Black and Latino families. So that's part of the story, and here obviously we're lifting up a message that's positive when we often hear more negative messages on these fronts. But the second point is to really try to encourage churches to raise the bar in ways that have been communicated by both panels, and to sort of recognize that talking more in a pastorally sensitive but sort of powerful way is needed, but also marrying that, no pun intended, with stronger ministries designed to meet people where they're at and move them to a better place when it comes to their relationships, their families, and their marriages. That both of these things we think are needed at this moment, an acknowledgement of where we've come and what we've done, and finally where we need to go. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and thank you all for joining us today.
Nice to meet you.